Time. Alrighty, I guess it is time. So, let us keep going. Here we'll see where we get to. Let's see what we can get done today. All right, hopefully everybody is doing okay. 1 week left in the semester. In some ways it's felt fast, in some ways it's felt slow. All good. Okay. So, questions. All right, so question, maybe it's from last time, I'm not sure. Would pagan-type atheist be an example of Gen Z non-religious? I mean, maybe. It depends. I'm not sure what pagan-type atheists are, but maybe. It depends. And again, I think I've said, people are not always super consistent with their identifications. Oh, thank you. I was just reading a middling review on Rate My Professor, which made me angry. Someone who midway, or at the end of Sociology of Religion, doesn't realize still that it was never meant to be a comparative religion class. They're like, we didn't learn anything about other religions. It's like, well, it's not for that. It's more how religion works. But okay. Maybe they haven't been coming to class. Who knows? What time would the exam be? I believe it is at 9 in the morning, but I could be wrong. I will double check. I will tell you next week, right? I will have... well, I mean, that is a question for philosophy, not a question for sociology. Sadly. Okay. How did I do that? If I click on them, do they get green? Oh, maybe if I push that. Oh, interesting. I did not know. I've learned something today. Okay. I'll give you announcements next week. I'll make sure I get the exam time. I'm pretty sure that it is at 9 a.m., but I will double check. I'm glad you enjoyed the class. Math, science, history. Okay. How hard would you rank the exam? Well, I haven't written it yet, so hardish. It'll be the same as the other ones, right? They're all basically the same. The questions come from the same place. All of that fun stuff. The final day is next Friday. Don't be thanking me just yet. We're not done. Oh, okay, an actual content question. Please come next week. There's still things to do. And I will definitely have a review and a Slido and all of that fun stuff. I think this is likely our last... I will not miss it either. This is probably our last topic. I have other ones ready to go, which I could, drop in there. But I figured let's take our time finishing this one, and we'll just call it after this topic. I have like 6 other units that I can just throw in, but that are all ready to go. But let's just stop. We'll call it a day. Education and mass media. They're good topics, but those are the ones that I'd probably throw in. But let's say this will be the last one, so we'll really take our time. Okay. Again, not a topic for sociology, a topic for a completely different class. Uh, I have no thoughts. I have no thoughts. All right. All right. What day is the final exam? I believe is the 15th. You're welcome. All right. Durkheim's view of the function of religion. Just think of Durkheim's view as a function of the function of religion, mostly as the function of religion. It's definitely not the 8th. It's not the 8th. It cannot be the last day of class. I would love it if we could do that, actually, but I'm not allowed. So we can't. I'm pretty sure it's the 15th. The 15th is like the Thursday of the first exam week. And I'm pretty sure it's at 9 a.m. But again, I'll announce it next week. Okay, function of religion, right? Friday? The day of Freya. Okay. All right. All right, I'll answer that other question in a second. Durkheim's view of religion, right? Religion binds people together, right? It binds societies together. It gives people common morals and values. It allows them to, have intellectual systems that kind of bind them together and allow for common action, right? It gives people, a sense that is grounded in something higher than the day-to-day. So all of those things are part of the function of religion, right? It's a structuring organization in society, basically, at the end of the day. Okay. Do I perceive sociology to be a discipline that welcomes religious people? You're scared of pursuing higher ed, that people view religious people as ignorant. I've never, to be honest, had a religious conversation with anyone in sociology in particular, right? It's not a topic. I think a lot of sociologists are a-religious, but there's lots of religious sociologists as well, and I don't think that inherently it's unfriendly to religious people. Everybody passes, more or less. 15th at 9 a.m. Okay, I was right. Sorry. I don't find, honestly, that there's any particular bias against religious people. I think more what you might find if you're a religious person in sociology is that a lot of sociologists will give you sort of a look of non-comprehension, right? It's like it is so alien to them that they cannot understand what you're talking about. And so they will be like, But hostility, no. I don't think people are overly hostile for the most part. There's certainly going to be some, right? But honestly, it's not like my boss, Sandra Bucerius, who's the kind of lead criminologist here, is a religious person. The chair, who's her good friend, teases her about it a little bit, but it's more on the level of kind of friendly teasing. It's not scary. All right. So, GTA Trail, okay. I've never played a GTA game. I'm sorry. I wasn't allowed as a kid because my parents thought it was bad, and I just never got into it. Okay. And now I have no time. I have only time for Rocket League. Can you pass this all so we can take more of your classes? I think it's pretty hard to fail, but it's very rare that people fail. You have to do something pretty special to fail my classes. So, anyway, let's move on. Like I said, we can take it slow. We got a little bit of time. All right, so one of the big kind of models for describing how religion works comes from, this cat. He's my favorite. I call him the honey badger of sociology of religion, because basically he just goes after everybody else, like it's going out of style. He passed away about a year and a half ago, unfortunately. But prior to that, he was one of the leading lights of sociology of religion. All right, so he came up, along with some of his friends, with what's called the market model of religion, right? To explain one particular kind of phenomenon that people were really struggling to explain, which is specifically, relating back to this question of the secularization thesis. If modernity is toxic to religion, then why does America remain so religious at its core, right? because the kind of modernity is toxic to religion thesis kind of makes sense if you think about Europe. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about the United States, right? The United States has, Europe has gone, at least in some accounts, from very religious in the Middle Ages to very irreligious today. The United States, on the other hand, for the most part, remains very religious, right? I just saw this infograph from Ryan Burge, really interesting guy. I talked to you about him last time, and basically, he said if you depicted American society as 100 people, right? 66 of them are Christian, and then only 18% of them, or 18 of them, are nothing in particular, right? So the vast majority of Americans are still religious. Okay, so Stark wants to answer this question, okay, why does the United States remain particularly religious? Well, Europe doesn't. And basically, to do this, he sort of works with some friends of his, particularly Roger Fink and William Bainbridge, who are both economists, right? And they come up with what they call the market model of religion, right? So basically, the market model proposes the following, right? That basically you have kind of two groups in society. You have, potential religious consumers, right? People who might be looking for a religious product, and religious firms that offer those religious products, right? So basically they're different kind of religious denominations or religious groups are like brands offering different kind of flavors of religion, right? Different experiences that people might want to consume. All right, flickety. Okay, so there's basically sort of two modes a society can exist in when it comes to the diversity of religions, or the kind of religious market that they have. One of which is the one that's more common in Europe historically and even to this day, which is a religious monopoly, right? A religious monopoly, I found a religion monopoly board because, I can spend time on Google image search. A religious monopoly basically exists when one religious body acquires special privileges from the state, right? So generally, these are societies where, they don't have a conception of a separation of church and state. Now, what happens is if one religious body, gains the favor of the state, they can essentially use the state's power to block any other religious firm from, offering their services, right? So today, you can think of a place like Saudi Arabia, right, as a religious, or Iran as a religious monopoly, right? They are places where the government is basically on the side of one particular religion. In this case, we'd be talking about Islam, and a particular form of Islam, of course. And basically what happens then is no one else can sort of enter that market, right? The state is enforcing the control of all religious activity, in that kind of area, basically being the purview of this one religion, right? Now, this was the case, of course, in Europe for a long time as well, and in some ways it still kind of is, right? For most of the Middle Ages, right, you would have had a Catholic religious monopoly through most of Europe. After 1517 and the Protestant Reformation, typically you had some kind of split. Either a state was Catholic or Protestant. The Catholic in the case of, say, France and Italy, Protestant in the case of, say, Sweden, Finland, and then some countries where two churches, after the Treaty of Westphalia, two churches would have essentially been government supported, right? Now, say Germany today, still the case that there are two basically official churches in Germany, the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. The state collects taxes, based on how many each of these churches has people that are their members in that society, and then gives the money to those churches. So you get a kind of religious monopoly, or I guess in Germany's case, a duopoly. Now what Stark says is this tends to lead to religions that are very lethargic, right? They get very, very lazy. Because, the clergy, whoever the imams, the priests, whatever, they don't have to do much to earn their paycheck, right? Whether anyone shows up on a at a Friday service or a Sunday morning doesn't really matter because they get their paycheck directly from the state. So they get extremely lazy. They stop trying to recruit members, right? Or stop trying to really deeply ingrain their religious messages into people, and they stop trying to attract people, right? They stop trying to create a product that would be interesting to people. And so you tend to have, in religious monopolies, relatively low rates of kind of religious action, right? People will not be that interested, and their level of religiosity is relatively low, right? And this was even the case, say, for a place that we think of as very Muslim today, like Egypt back in the 1980s. There's a very, very low kind of religious salience in Egyptian society. Everyone was Muslim, but not everybody cared. Okay. So the other kind of possibility is religious pluralism, or, here you should think a free market. Right? A religiously free market. Right. So in countries that permit open competition among religions, you tend to get a lot more diversity of religions, right? People will split off, right? If they don't like how things are going, or they think that you're not working. I forgot the projector. All right. I can keep talking for a minute and a half while this goes back up 3 times this semester. It's always something. Why do they automatically shut off? All right, I will talk loud. Right, so in a free market, right, I'm sorry about this. As soon as that opens up, I'll turn it back on. In a religious free market, right, you're going to have a lot of competition, and you're going to get a lot of religious innovation, according to Stark. Right, you're going to have people who one thing that you're not going to have typically is any kind of state support, right? So no religions are going to receive funds from the government, which means if you're a religious clergyman and you want to pay your bills and you want to eat, you're going to have to convince people to give you money, right? That ultimately, you're worthwhile investing in. So you're going to be much more responsive, ultimately, than someone who's in a monopoly, right? You're going to work hard to attract people. You're going to make your religious services and your religious beliefs, in a lot of cases, as attractive as possible, right? And it will tend to foster, in Stark's mind, a lot of pluralism, right? A lot of religious experimentation, a lot of trial and error, a lot of things that don't work, a lot of new religious movements, and ultimately a lot of religious vitality. And Stark sort of compares it in the following way. Not a thought behind those eyes. Okay. I don't know what that is. Okay. I'm just checking what my next slide is. Okay. I'm good here. Stark compares, the situation to any kind of limited market, right? Let's say a market for restaurants. What Stark says is that if you were, say, in a small town, or let's say a medium-sized town in Alberta, right? And one restaurant moves in. Let's say, what's a stereotypical Alberta restaurant? Boston Pizza. Is there, the restaurant no one really wants to go to, but everyone ends up at anyway. Right, so a Boston Pizza opens up in this city, and it is the only restaurant. Now, that Boston Pizza, and let's say that the town says that we are officially sponsored by Boston Pizza, and so, you can only be Boston Pizzonians, and no other restaurants will be allowed to set up here. What Stark would say is you're going to get a certain amount of interest, right? People who like the menu offering at Boston Pizza will continue to patronize it, but for everyone else, they're not going to be interested, and they're going to stay home and they're going to cook their own food. However, so you're going to have a level of kind of consumption of restaurant food, but it's going to stay relatively low, right? Only people who want to eat at Boston Pizza are going to eat there, right? Or say, if you think of a different example, if all you have open is an A&W, right? Only people that like burgers are actually going to consume restaurant food. However, if the projector wants to turn back on, it's still the same slide, don't worry. If you end up in a situation where, ta-da, all right, microphone, turn back on so I don't have to shout. Better. All right. If you end up in a situation where you have, a burger restaurant and a pizza place and a Thai restaurant and a Vietnamese restaurant and a Chinese food restaurant, right? And et cetera, et cetera. What Stark would say is you're going to have more people who find a type of food that they really enjoy, and therefore there's going to be more market activity in terms of restaurants, right? In a richer market. The same thing with religion. The more different religious forms you have available, the more likely it is that you're going to have more people consuming religion. In a monopoly situation, only a small percentage of the people who find, say, Catholicism or, Sunni Islam in its, say, Wahhabist form, as you might find in parts of Saudi Arabia, are going to be consumers of religion. Everyone else, while they might say, yes, I'm religious or Catholic, they're actually not going to be very active, right, in the marketplace. They might not attend or do a lot of the religious actions. So how does this explain the difference between Europe and the United States, right? Europe had, kind of state churches in most places, right? And even like I said, Germany still does. Sweden still has an official state church, hilariously, until recently, and maybe still was run by an atheist, which I think is funny. It tells you something about the religious intensity of the Church of Sweden. Finland has a state church. England still has an official state church, the Church of England. The head of that particular church is today King Charles, right? And it has been the English reigning monarch ever since the days of Henry VIII. So you had a lot of state churches, and other churches were repressed, which led to low levels of religious intensity, so that when you entered modernity, right, you were already at a low ebb of religion. The United States, on the other hand, has, separation of church and state built into the U.S. Constitution, right? In the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of religion, right? There's no establishment of a state church. It's not allowed in the U.S. Constitution, and they're not allowed to abridge religious liberty in any way under the Constitution. So what's happened is you've had a multiplication of religious forms in the United States. By some counts, there's as many as 50,000 different Protestant denominations. And what you've seen in the United States is a very rich kind of generation of new religious forms, right? So for instance, in the early 19th century, about the 1820s, you get Mormonism, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints appearing in the United States. But you get other things like Seventh-day Adventists, in the later part of the 19th century. At the beginning part of the 20th century, you get Pentecostalism, this particular form of Protestantism that now globally has something in the range of 600 to 800 million members, right? It is basically, behind Roman Catholicism, the second largest Christian denomination, right? So you've had, because of this religious free market, and that, if you want to start a church, all you need is a few people to follow you, and you can call yourself Pastor Jeff, right? And you can, do whatever you want. All you need is some followers and a space to meet in, and you're pretty much set, which is basically the story of Mormonism. There's a lot of religious innovation that goes on, which means more people find a flavor of religion that appeals to them at the end of the day. Okay. What are folk religions? Okay, even in religious monopolies, wouldn't different firms, churches, still strive to be better so they have the most members? So again, I will get to Stark's theory isn't perfect. And, less people now ascribe to a strict market theory than did maybe 15, 20 years ago, because there are these sorts of inherent contradictions in it. It explains actually the American and European example really well. Some other places it doesn't explain as well. Yeah, in religious monopolies, wouldn't different firms, churches still strive to be better so they have the most members? This doesn't seem to have been the case in Europe, right? Where I think there's a lot of evidence of pretty lazy clergy. There's a lot of other things that go on, and we could talk about it in a different class because it's too into the weeds, I think. But there was things like purchasing of priestly offices that happened a lot in the Middle Ages, right? You're a rich landowner, but you can only pass your land on to typically your oldest son, so you have to find something that's going to keep your second oldest son and third oldest son out of trouble. So a lot of people would buy like a priestly office, right? So you are now, I've paid the bishop, and you are now the priest at St. Bonaventure's church. Now that person may have collected a paycheck and never actually been. There's lots of evidence that that's the case. But you don't seem to have generated that much religious intensity. And Max Weber, when he traveled from Germany to the United States in the middle part of the 19th century, was shocked at how religious America was. Because he's like, in Germany, everybody's a Lutheran or a Catholic, but no one cares, right? Whereas, in America, he's like, these people are giving, like, out of an $8,000 annual salary, they're giving $1,000 of their income to support the church that they belong to. So very different kind of system. There's not a lot of fervor in religious monopolies, or at least close to monopolies. Malaysia and Indonesia. This is one of the contradictions, right? In some cases, you do get places with religious monopolies, or at least apparent religious monopolies, that do have high levels of intensity. And I mean, if you look all over the Arab world today, right, you have a lot of, at least seemingly, very intense Islam, right? Now, that said, are they as much monopolies as we think they are? There certainly are slightly different brands and slightly different kind of imams and preachers that might be kind of different flavors. There's also the kind of theory that these are ultimately a kind of reaction to modernity, right? And to the encroaching of modernity into these societies. And so that, folding into kind of a religious identity has been a reaction, almost an opposite reaction of what you got in the West and secularization. In the Islamic world, it's like a reaction against the West. And secularization is an intense form of kind of religion. But it's a good point, and that's where, market theory somewhat breaks down. What are folk religions? Folk religions, are religions that are mostly kind of, they tend to be less structured, and they tend to be, traditional religions of particular peoples, right? So things like Chinese folk religion, China has a very long history of syncretizing, like taking a bunch of different religious beliefs and kind of cobbling it together. But some things like in Chinese folk religion, right, they have their own kind of local gods and household gods, but also like spirit or ancestor worship, right, is big in some forms of Chinese folk religions, right? But think of it like it's the religion of a kind of limited local peoples, right? Would be a folk religion. Okay. So in sociology, does credibility to accuracy not matter as much? So when Rodney Stark I'm not aware of any time Rodney Stark rejected evolution. You'd have to fill me in on that, because I've read, I think, all of Rodney's work, and I've never heard him reject evolution. But I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I don't believe he ever rejected evolution. And, for the most part of his career, he was not a religious person in the slightest. But again, I may have missed something and I could be wrong. But as far as I know, Stark never rejected evolution. I'm very funny today. I'm not trying to be. Okay. All right, let's go. All right. So, in terms of market theory has these, I will say, somewhat clunky terms that are somewhat kind of maybe a little bit Eurocentric in terms of the way they describe, different kinds of modes of kind of religious institutions, right? So church. Now, a church could be, anything, right? It could be like, Sunni or Shia Islam could, in this kind of definition, be a church, right? Which I know sounds weird and is a little bit awkward, but this is the kind of terminology. And one of the things about sociology of religion is it mostly developed to explain religion in the West, and then has kind of tried to branch out into other parts of the world, meaning that sometimes its terminology ends up being a little clunky. So, but I love it anyway. Church, any bureaucratic religious organization that's fully accommodated into the mainstream. Right, so these are mainstream organizations that mostly get along with society, right? That is a church in the mind of market theory. Okay, a sect, right? So a sect would be one kind of group that breaks off of a church, right? Usually because there's a disagreement about some kind of religious teaching or religious doctrine, right? So they break away from a church so that they can return to a kind of purer doctrine, at least in their minds, right? They want to get away from the corruption of the world that's crept into the church, right? Whether this is, the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church or the Church of England or, the, mainstream Sunni Islam, right? It's a kind of sect, right? They split off. Now, typically sects are less integrated into society, right? They are more at odds. They tend to have higher levels of tension with predominant social values, right? And they're often seen as a little bit more out there and weird by the average person. They're also less structured and less bureaucratized than churches, right? Once a church gets really, really established, right, it will have these massive bureaucracies that run it, right? It'll have things like places to educate, young people, clergy. It'll have institutional structures to govern the life, a decision-making structure that runs, what are the official beliefs and all of these kinds of things. Sects generally don't have that. They tend to be much smaller and they tend to be much more organic about their decision-making. All right, a denomination. A denomination sort of sits midway on the continuum between a church and a sect in this kind of market model, right? So basically, it's less bureaucratized and less organized, typically, than a church. It has still, it is bureaucratized. It does have a structure, but it's less so than a church. It's less at odds with social values, right? It tends to be more tolerant of kind of worldly values and society in general. And it tends, to maintain relatively tolerant kind of relationships with other kind of denominations of, within a particular religion. Okay, so new religious movements are the last one. You might know them by their more colloquial, cult, or cults, right? They're more colloquially called cults. Not typically used in sociology of religion for lots of reasons, because we don't want to be pejorative. And some of them end up turning into religions proper, right? For example, Christianity starts essentially as a new religious movement that is a sect of Judaism, right? And eventually it grows and grows and grows and becomes the world's largest religion, right? So, to be less dismissive of cults is a good idea. And Mormons, right? Mormons, started as a new religious movement in the 1820s and, essentially have grown over the course of about 2 centuries to become really the first new religion founded, or the youngest of the kind of major religions to have been founded, right? Okay, so what was a new religious movement? All right, it's a group, typically headed by charismatic leaders, but always with a unique religious vision, right? And almost always rejects mainstream culture and society. Now, when you get into cults proper, there are certain behaviors that cults engage in that, say, a new religious movement might not. One of them is typically that they tend to try to socially isolate and cut off pre-existing social ties that people have outside of the cult, right? So if you, I don't know, if you, join the church, the God is Mother people that apparently stalk around campus, right? There's a pretty good chance that, they're going to want you to come live at their compound, and they're going to want you to cut off your ties with people outside of the group, right? Nexium, like modern cults, often, that one was also multi-level marketing, but that's neither here nor there. Multi-level marketing, I think, is a kind of cult, but, so when someone tries to sell you Tupperware, you can frankly tell them that they're in a cult of some kind. Or Epicure. Epicure's always been the one. I'm like, I don't need your spices, and I need you to leave my house. And no, I don't want to join your cult. So, cults will generally try to cut people off from their pre-existing social ties and have things like, you give them all of your money and property and reject fully kind of the culture that you came out of. All right, wait, I should go back just to check. Is Jehovah's Witness a sect or a denomination? These are interesting questions. So Shia Islam start as a sect and become a church. Could depend on the location. I mean, I think both Shia and Sunni Islam now we would consider, they start as kind of, sects of Islam, and they kind of, now have become pretty established. Islam is a little bit different, and some of Islam resists some of this categorization as well, because Islam has never had the same kind of organizational structure as, say, Christianity has, typically, right? Like you think of Christianity, and especially, say, like Roman Catholicism, there's the Pope at the top, and then there's cardinals and bishops and priests, and then there's, religious who are not priests, so monks and nuns, and then the laity, right? Very kind of hierarchical, and we know who's in charge. It's Pope, you're right, today it's Pope Francis. So, Francis. Islam is a little bit different, right? There's never been as much of a central governing authority in Islam. Its ties to the state are a little bit different. So it's sometimes hard to categorize in these terms, which is why I say, like, sometimes this language, church, sect, new religious movement, all that stuff, is a little bit clunky for defining other religions, right? So I think Shiism, could be, say a sect in Saudi Arabia, a church in Iraq, and say Iran. Or Iran. But like I said, the language is a little bit clunky, which is why, in a lot of cases, people have stopped using these particular terms because they don't work beautifully. Is Jehovah's Witness a sect or a denomination? So I would tend to describe Jehovah's Witnesses as a sect. Although, because they're still pretty at odds with mainstream culture in lots of ways, right? Like no blood transfusions, no birthdays. There's some other things. I can't remember all of the exact teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The no birthdays thing always troubled me a little bit. It's like, but birthdays are the best. People give you stuff. So I think of them more as a sect, especially in the way that they're kind of set off from society. They've been around for a long time, though, so they've just never quite gone in there. They are pretty, if you wanted to make a case that they might be a denomination, you could also say that, the Jehovah's Witnesses are pretty bureaucratized, right? They do have a pretty good bureaucratic a way that they work. Okay, there's lots of questions. So would something like the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, that's the people in like Bountiful, BC, be a sect? They're a sect of Mormonism or of the Latter-day Saints, right? They've split off from the Latter-day Saints because they have doctrinal differences with the Latter-day Saints. And of course, they're very rejected by the mainstream, both Mormonism and mainstream society, right? Things like polygamy and marrying 12-year-old girls will do that to you. It's neither here nor there. Who am I to judge, aside from a decent person? Okay. So having trouble understanding a denomination, right? All right, let me think. What would a denomination be if I could give you an example that's going to resonate in your brain? Fundamentalist Mormons with an O, not an A. Fundamentalist Mormons marry multiple people. It was banned in the mainstream Latter-day Saints when Utah became a state. I can't remember what year Utah became a state in the U.S., but they got a revelation through the prophet that said, yeah, we need to drop this polygamy thing. God didn't like it anymore, apparently, being mean to Mormons. Is there any class where you would be studying cults and the way they operate? There is a religious studies class. We used to have one in the Department of Sociology, but the professor resigned, and I'm not an expert on cults the way he was. I saw a placard for it on the second floor of Torrey. There is a religious studies class, but I don't remember the number. I will try to find out. Okay, a denomination, right? So typically we would think of a denomination like something like, say, the Baptists, like the Baptist churches in Canada would be a denomination. They're less bureaucratized, right? They tend to have kind of a loose coalition of beliefs. Pentecostals in Canada, I think, would fit, like Pentecostal Church, PAOC, Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, I think, would be a denomination as well, in the sense that they have kind of a loose organizing structure, right? They're definitely less bureaucratic than, say, the Lutherans or the Catholics, but they're still more or less at peace. With society, right? So they're sort of like midway. They're definitely not like the God as Mother people, or a sect that's really at odds with Canadian values, but they are, still not quite as organized as, say, the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. Would the one being called a sect in Islam initially just be the one with less followers in 632 than becoming a church? Oh, my Islamic history friends. Yes, I'm sorry, like my memory on I read about this in Tom Holland's book on the rise of Islam, but I'm having trouble remembering the exact parameters of which is which. I think Islam, I say it's kind of split. Yeah, one of them was a sect of Islam, the smaller one, the one with less members. But Islam was still kind of forming at the time. It was still relatively early in Islam's history, so it might not fit this categorization very neatly. But like, if you looked at, say, Wahhabism, right? Wahhabism kind of splitting off as a kind of sect of Sunni Islam definitely fits that better, maybe, than the Sunni Shia split. Okay, what about the Amish? The Amish, I think, are probably a Christian sect. That's probably the best way to, they're very nice people. But they're probably more of a sect than anything else because they're, again, only kind of loosely organized. All right. Must go forward. How much time do I have left? 9 minutes. People are already leaving with 9 minutes. I know, we're far away. Okay, so sects and new religious movements. What is their path? Most of them end up here, right? Most of them disappear. Most new religious movements end up actually not, and sects not succeeding, right? And like on average, they have about a 40-year life, right? So most like new religious movements and sects, a lot of them will sort of promise something. A lot of them are apocalyptic for whatever reason. So a lot of them end up promising things like, Jesus is going to come back, within our lifetime. Some, like the Seventh-day Adventists, are like, Jesus is going to come back this day. They do calculations based on what's in the Bible. And, what happens to most of them is when that doesn't happen and that first generation of people who joined realize that maybe this didn't work out, they quit, they leave, and the whole thing falls apart. That is the most typical path for a new religious movement. Okay, some of them persist, right? Some of them will be like the Seventh-day Adventists actually survived, right? They said, okay, Jesus is going to come back this day. They all gathered in a field. Nothing happened. And then they were like, okay, we got the math wrong. It's actually going to be on this day. They went out to the field. Nothing happened. And then the leader was like, Jesus did come back, but he came back in our hearts. Right, that was a true story. And then, freed of surviving that kind of 40-year curse for new religious movements and sects, then, Seventh-day Adventism became more and more established and became more church-like. I would say now it's probably a denomination because it gets along with people pretty well. They may become institutionalized, right? They move kind of in the denomination kind of church direction in a lot of cases. But like 99% probably of them end up right here, they die out. Okay. So as your excellent questions have sort of borne out, the market theory is not a watertight theory. How am I doing for time? Doing okay still. Not a watertight theory. A lot of Muslim majority countries have near monopolies, but religious observance is widespread. Now, sometimes it looks widespread, but it actually is much less widespread than you might think, right? Say in Iran, it's like, yes, everybody is a Shia in Iran, but if you actually dig into it, it's like something like 45% would consider themselves, not non-religious, but non-believing Muslims, right? There's a really big diversity in Iran, and a lot of people who kind of have rejected Islam because of its tight ties to the state. So sometimes things can look very unified, but they aren't. But anyway, the Muslim world is a bit of a hard one for market theory to explain, at least on the surface, right? Because everything, they are near monopoly situations, but right now they're experiencing a lot of religious intensity. As I say, this widespread observance is a relatively recent phenomenon. It really starts in the 1980s. Certainly the experience in Egypt was, say, Coptic Christians lived in Egypt for millennia, and they got along with the Muslim majority there until about the 1980s, when they started to face really severe persecution as Islam got much more intense. Okay, the other kind of problem, places like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have relatively free and unregulated religious markets, but they've experienced declines in religion at much faster rates than the United States. So the United States is very much the outlier, right? Even in unregulated markets, the United States remains much more religious. Okay, so what's the future of religion? We don't really know. Likely we're going to continue to see gradual secularization, right? So the decline of religion, especially in the West. But I think you're also going to see religious people sort of reacting to secularization and trying to create new forms of religion that might appeal to people, right? So that's going to, you're going to see, I think, a lot of efforts by religious people ultimately to kind of gin up interest in religion again. At the same time, right, there's going to be more religious forms available, especially as, immigration brings more and more different people to Canada. All right, I can do one more or a couple more quick slides, and we'll be closer to the end for Monday, when we'll end with Actually, 3 minutes. Let's leave it here. We'll talk about some religious landscape stuff on Monday. I got just a few more slides, and then we'll be done. And then we'll be done the course on Monday. We'll finish with religion. Wednesday, we'll do review, like Q&A review. And Friday, we can do a Kahoot. That'll be fun. All right. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.